In this video tutorial, we'll look at creating a realistic and adjustable material in Unreal that can create a never-ending variation of ice, gems, and crystals. Let's check out in detail what we'll be able to produce with this adjustable material that we'll be creating. With the material that we create, we'll be able to take any geometry and throw on a material that we can adjust. I've adjusted some settings here, but this is kind of like a pink crystal material that we'll be able to create. So it really has the feeling of actually having some crystals or some sort of gems inside. And this is kind of a little bit of a cheat and a hack. It's not actually geometry in there or anything. It's just an illusion based on the camera angle. Now, all this is going to be done using parallax occlusion mapping or offset bump mapping. Now, I have another video on parallax occlusion mapping. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. It'll be a good way to kind of understand what's going on in this video in a little bit more detail. But we'll be able to create things like this pink crystal or this magma rock where it's kind of glowing a little bit, or ice. You kind of can see through it and you see these chunks of maybe snow or bigger ice chunks frozen inside. So this material is going to be super flexible. All these different materials, even this jade here, that you can kind of see through a bit. This is all made with the exact same material, just different settings, different colors, different patterns used in the parallax occlusion mapping, and nothing really specific. It's just a bunch of kind of masks that are being used and some color adjustments to produce all these materials. And you can produce things more complex with this, but we're going to take a look at how we can create this material. And one other thing we'll just take a look at before we begin is the geometry shape of your gemstone or your rock also makes a big difference. If we take a look at this here and I rotate around it, it has this really nice kind of shimmering effect. And if I zoom in, we kind of see that effect in more detail here, and it looks pretty cool. It looks pretty awesome, but really that shimmering effect is a little bit of a cheat. Maybe this is more of a useful approach for lower polygon gemstones and things, even though this is pretty high poly here. But one thing that I did to this rock to kind of make it respond like that with that shimmering effect is all the normals are set to hard edged. So if we zoom in, we can kind of see all these polygons be faceted. And most times you don't want that. Most times you don't want your mesh to be faceted. Maybe you're using a normal map or things on top as well. This can cause problems if you set your mesh to be hard normal edges or faceted like this. But in some cases, it can also work to your benefit. So keep that in mind. Geometry matters. How you set your shading or smoothing of your geometry also matters on how its reflection is going to respond. So if the edges are faceted or set to hard edges like this, every little polygon, every little triangle will kind of just reflect almost like what you expect from like a diamond, where it's very hard and jagged cut with these sharp edges, and it gives it a better highlight or reflection or response to light. The same is kind of true for what you produce in Unreal or in game engines as well. If you set your normal angles to hard edges, in some cases that can be beneficial. Most cases probably not, but as you can see here, it can help get us this kind of shimmering effect. So keep in mind geometry shape, geometry shading groups or smoothing groups of them all contribute to how that surface is going to respond to light as well. Now, the material that we create will be a base where you could dial in many different settings, add different kind of texture maps or patterns, and produce different types of looking rock. And you'll have controls to add glow. So if you want gems that are glowing from the inside, you can do that. Like if I throw on this magma rock kind of material and I turn off all the lights, it's glowing because it's going to be using glow or emissive. If I add something like the pink crystal on here, it will respond correctly. It doesn't glow or have any light response from inside of it. But if I turn on a point light, there it is. It still works when you have different types of lighting situations. And that's very important. You want to make materials that respond in any lighting situation correctly. And you do get a little bit of an illusion here. And this is kind of a trick that this naturally happens with our reflection and then also a bump map or a specular highlight and a bump map that is kind of tied to the parallax occlusion mapping depth. We kind of get this illusion that that crystal here, maybe I'll just highlight it, this crystal is glowing or kind of being lit up. Light's going into it and kind of illuminating it. And the light that we have, the point light, it's kind of right here, so it's kind of facing that angle. And again, it's a bit of an illusion, but it kind of gives the illusion that light is going into that kind of crystal and making it brighter. Really, when it's not, it's just that the reflection is supposed to happen there on the ball, but we have a bump map that gets offset with the parallax occlusion mapped UVs and gives the illusion that that shape is actually lighting up. So even if I take my light and I move it to a different part or a different angle, then that highlight will move and it'll now seem like this kind of crystal area is lighting up. So it's a lot of really kind of simplistic cheats just added all together, and it gives us a much more complex result. So you can do a lot of cool stuff with this, and it's not just working in one lighting situation. These materials should be able to work in any of your scenes, in any of your lighting situations, if you dial in the properties and set them up correctly. So to begin making this material, I'm just going to create a sphere to test things on. I'll create a brand new material. So I'm just going to go in here, right click, create a material, call it m_gem material. I'll open it up. I'm going to be doing this in Unreal 5.2 with Substrate shading, but nothing here will be specific to Substrate. So you could do this in any version of Unreal, any previous version of Unreal, and even other game engines that have similar features. You could probably replicate this approach. There's nothing specific to Substrate. So what we're going to start off with is getting our depth effect on our material. So I'm going to go in here and connect our diffuse albedo to a texture, which is going to be offset by parallax occlusion mapping. Now the textures that I'm going to be using are nothing complex. They're not made for any specific type of gem or surface. I'm just going to be using textures that look like this. So really easy stuff. Most of these I've made in under a couple minutes each. They're not great. They're just very, very simplistic, kind of like a clouds pattern or Voronoi or Perlin noise and some adjustments. You can make this stuff in Substance Designer or Photoshop or whatever other 2D editing software you want or use very quickly. So nothing really special. Anyone part of the Patreon will get access to these actual textures, but they're nothing great. You can make whatever you want and make your own library of a bunch of interesting patterns that can be useful. So I'm going to go and just start off in our material here. First thing we have to do, parallax occlusion mapping, we're going to start off with. This is going to give us some fake offset into the material, so it feels like there's gems or some sort of crystal structures or things inside the actual shape, really when there's not. So I'm going to create this parallax occlusion mapping setup. Definitely watch the parallax occlusion mapping video I have if you want to go over this in detail about all this, but we're just going to speed through it. So I'm going to bring in my texture. So I'm just going to do a texture sample. There we go. Connect its UVs up. Done. And then roughness. I'm just going to start off with really low roughness. So it's very glossy. It's not like 0.1 will be fine. I'm just blocking in values so that we get something started. Height map texture. Again, we'll need a texture sample or texture object technically. So I could just create that. Height ratio, how much it offsets. I'm just going to put in placeholder value of 0.1. UVs, so I need a texture coordinate node. And then height map channel, we're just going to do the red channel. There we go. Red or X. Actually, that's B4, so I need to do constant for vector. That always gets me. There we go. And then we're good. So that'll give us some parallax occlusion mapping. Now I need some textures to plug in here. So I'm just going to go back to those textures that I have and just throw some of them in as a way of testing this out. So texture, I'm just going to grab which one looks interesting. This one looks interesting. Pop it in there. Pop it in here. And save. And look what we get. You can see in our preview here. Oh wow, cool. We get a lot of interesting shapes because that's the parallax occlusion mapping at work. And we can change this height ratio and make it less pushed in or more pushed in. So we already get kind of like a 3D kind of effect. So it looks pretty basic right now. And if we go and apply this on some sort of like what we have here, our sphere. Okay, there it is. So we kind of see that pattern being pushed in. It's all right, but we need some color added to this. So let's go in here and add some more complexity. So you could use texture maps for color and stuff, but it'd be nice to be able just to have it kind of more procedural, or you just dial in the colors you want. That way you can make many different types of gems and materials from this setup. So that's what we're going to aim for. So I'm going to drag out a bit of room here so we could see this network a bit better. And I'll tint this pattern here with a color. So I'm just going to add a constant 3 vector that gives us a color, and then we just multiply those two together. A multiplied by B, and that becomes our new diffuse color. And now if I dial in a color for this, so if I were to make it like kind of red, a little bit of green, a little bit of blue, and now we look at this, okay, it's kind of like red or pink kind of colored. That's pretty cool. Now it's tinting it, but we need some depth. So we want to have maybe the white parts or the brighter parts of this texture be adjustable separately from the darker parts, the parts where it's kind of dipped in. So maybe what we'll do is add a lerp. So it's like a blend. We need a mask for that lerp. So I'll use this map here. And then what we're going to do is for that lerp, it's going to be a color. So I'll add another color here. Maybe I'll make it blue just so we could see the contrast of it. Maybe a little bit of red, a little bit of green, like a purple. And then if it's not masked out, it will use this color here. And that will become our new diffuse color. So now we're using this as a mask to be able to choose what the deeper areas are and the closer areas to the surface are. So if we start to dial this in a bit more carefully, like a lighter blue for the areas that are close to the surface, and a darker blue for areas that are deeper, then it's going to give us the illusion of depth. So we already start to get something that looks pretty cool. So now we have our controls for like parts that are raised higher, parts that are dipped in lower. And ideally you want to take these, convert them to parameter, and give them proper naming so you can easily adjust it. And that's kind of what you want to be able to do. So I could go in here and convert this to parameter and call it tint depth, and then convert this to parameter and call it tint surface. And then what we can do if we were to save this, is where the power of it comes. You can make an instance of that material. And then if I throw an instance on here, open it up. I don't really like this preview here. I usually just like looking at it in the viewport. I go here, tint depth, tint surface, and quickly and easily adjust this. So the depth could be like that, and then the surface can be like this. And now we kind of start to get something that looks pretty interesting. Maybe the depth area could be a little bit brighter, a little bit more saturated. There we go. So you start to get something that looks pretty interesting. And it's adjustable. And you can separate those into groups and things. Now this is just my instance material, so I have to go back to the original one to make any major changes, and it will just update. Be sure you know about instance materials. It's very useful to make things flexible and save a bit of performance by reusing materials instead of recreating new ones each time. So now going back to this graph, what else can we add to make this look a lot better? Well, normal maps are going to help drastically in giving us depth. and a better looking material here. So what I'm going to end up doing next is adding a normal map. So I'm just going to go here and drag this normal area out, create another texture sample, pop in a normal map. Now, what normal maps do I have? Let's go take a look. Oh, I can't save that because it's a map plugged in there. But if I go here, what normal map do we want to use? Which ones do I have here? I got a bunch. Maybe I'm just going to use this one. Pop it in. Now this is going to be interesting. This is going to be important. So by default, your normal map is going to use the UVs of your mesh, which is going to be pretty much the surface. So right now, if I look at this material, it looks like a blue crystally thing. I don't know what you want to call it. And the surface has this bump. That's our normal map, giving us that faked kind of wobbly pattern. Now, this is because that normal map is being wrapped around the sphere surface. But if I connect the UVs of the normal map up to our parallax UVs, then that normal map is going to inherit this height map depth and be bound to those shapes and give us a different look. So you can see now how it's kind of lighting up or reflecting more on the 3D shapes. And it doesn't feel like it's coated with the surface. Whereas when I'm not using those parallax UVs, disconnect that. Now it feels like it's just kind of like a glossy surface and those shapes below. So that can give you a lot of control to make different materials. So what I would recommend doing when you create these normal maps and things like that, that can benefit from using either parallax UVs or non-parallax UVs, is create something like a switch parameter. And then you can create a switch that says normal to use palm UVs. And then you can connect that up to UVs. And if you check that true, it uses the parallax UVs. If you check it to false, it just uses the normal texture coordinates. And that way you have a control to toggle that effect on and off. So if I were to save this and go back to my instance material here, now we're going to have a control that says normal to use parallax occlusion mapping UVs. If I check it on, then the normals stick to the offset UVs that match the shapes or the height map that I have. Whereas if I turn that off, then it kind of just maps that normal map effect to the surface. So things like that are going to be important to add control so you can have a lot of different ways to make this material look the way that you want. So that's something I'm just bringing up because you're probably going to want to do that when building out this material. But already we have a pretty good starting point here. So the next thing that we're going to want to do to add a bit more detail to this is probably have the ability to add some glow to our material as well. It'd be cool to have materials that are kind of rocky, but maybe light is coming from the center of the object or from the depths of it, almost like it has a core that's growing or kind of magical. So that's where we're going to use emissive color. And I can take the emissive color, and just as a very simple example, when I take it, I'm going to create a 1 minus node that's like invert. I'm going to invert this texture here because right now those darker areas are the depths of the texture, the parts that are pushed in. So we're going to invert that so they become white and use that as our emissive so that the areas that are kind of pushed in will be glowing. So it feels like the glowing is coming from the depths of the material. So I'm going to take this texture here, run it through a 1 minus to invert it, put it into my emissive, and now it looks like the center part's glowing. Now maybe it's too extreme and I want to color it. So I'll add a multiply to multiply that inverted texture by a color, constant 3 vector. Throw that into the emissive color. Now I can choose a color. Maybe I want the center of this to glow red. So there we go. I'm going to choose red or pink, whatever. Now it's going to glow red. And maybe that's a bit too extreme. So one thing that could also be a nice control is to add something like a cheap contrast. And I guess we could do that before the invert or after. Maybe after is better. And we can just have a contrast amount that's controllable. So we can go in here, add a contrast, constant number, and now you'll be able to control the contrast of that glow. So I'm going to convert this to glow contrast, and then I'm going to convert this to parameter called glow color. Save this. Go back to this to look at it. Open it up. It's pretty messed up right now, but let's try this out. So glow color. Sure, maybe it glows blue. And then you have the ability to do glow contrast. So I can make it more in the center or less. And that glow could be darker or brighter. And you start to have this control. So this is kind of important to be able to give the control to do things like that. And if you don't want to have any glow, just make it black. And then it's not doing any emissive anymore. So very easy to add more controls for glow. So if we go back to our material, now we got our glow set up. What else can we do? Now, at this point, your material's starting to get a little bit messy or not too organized. So at this point, it probably would be good to start grouping things and making things a bit more organized. Like take your parallax occlusion mapping stuff, right click, comment from selection, parallax occlusion mapping, or bump offset, whatever you want to use, and group that and give yourself some more space. Same thing for our color. This is all to do with our color here. All this and this. So take it, create a comment, right click, comment, diffuse or color. Now we got that separated. You can also color code these. You already kind of know this, but color code it. And then we got our normal map here. So we can start grouping all this stuff. We got our glow down here. So again, comment, glow, comment, normal. And makes it way easier to work with. Now you're not kind of going crazy looking all over the place. You know exactly what you need to adjust and zoom in, and you can start to adjust what you need to change. So organization is going to be key to keep this thing manageable. So from here, you want to probably add some more adjustments. You want to be able to maybe also add patterns to these different colors, or add a pattern into this. Like we're multiplying it by the inverted map here, but maybe instead of doing that, we connect it to another texture sample. So you could change those textures individually and have the glow separated like a different pattern than what you have for your diffuse or for your height or your parallax occlusion mapping here. And I haven't converted this one to a parameter, but I should. So I could call this like palm height, and you'll be able to change it. So the idea is to make sure you have enough control to change the things you need to change to get the looks that you want. And you might find that with a bit of trial and error. You might make your material, play around with it, notice, hey, I need control over this. Then you go back in here, you add that control. And you do that a couple times, and then sooner or later you have a material that's kind of fully featured that can do all the things you want to do. So that's something that I recommend to try. Like start making something as simple as this, and then you can start to add more controls. You definitely want control over roughness, so we can also convert this to a parameter. Let's call it roughness. Maybe you want the ability to have a texture to break up the roughness. So you'd multiply that by a texture sample and also convert that to a parameter. Maybe you want control over tiling UVs. So if I want to tile my parallax occlusion mapping UVs or tile my normal mapping UVs, you want to add control for that. So all these things you have to think about and add control for. And just as an example, if I want to add tiling for my UVs for my parallax occlusion mapping here, I could take my UV coordinates. So you think about a UV coordinates, it's two channels, U and V, or horizontal and vertical, that store the UVs. You could change your U tiling, V tiling in here, but we want that controlled in our instance material. And you can't right click and convert this to a parameter. So I think one of the easiest ways to get this to work the way we want and have controls for tiling on both those axes would be to create two constants. So I create 1, 2. I'll give them each a different parameter name. One of them is going to be called tiling pom U, tiling pom V. Leave them 1 by default. Append vector. They append them both together. And then all you have to do after this is pretty much get these values to be multiplied by these values. So then you can just do a simple multiply. So multiply this by this. That becomes your new UVs. And if we save this and we go check out our gem material here and look at our viewport, we have these controls, tiling pom U, tiling pom V. There we go. I can tile in both directions. However, I want a roughness control now. So low contrast and the ability to add a glow color. I also have the ability to change the parallax occlusion mapping height texture. So maybe I use a different texture, something like this. And that's going to do the depth a little bit differently. It looks weird because we still have the color using the other pattern, but maybe I'll just choose something even more drastic like this and maybe add control for the height or strength of that parallax occlusion mapping. So here, height ratio, convert to parameter, pom height amount. Maybe also go to my color map, convert that to parameter, color, or diffuse. Maybe normal map we want to change, convert that to parameter, normal map. So all these things you have to be kind of active on making them controls. And now we have all those controls. So now I can change the pom height. I can also change the diffuse color to a different pattern. Now we can kind of see how that works. Maybe I change it to something like this. Now it's a different type of pattern. It looks more like ice or something in there. Maybe the normal map I don't like. That's I'm using here. I could change that to something different. So you probably want control over normal map strength, right? Because maybe if I choose something like this, oh, it's cool, but it's too strong. So how do I add a control for normal strength? Well, normal strength is based on kind of the ratio of red and green to blue, or those two directions, and depth. So what you can do easily to add a normal map control is just multiply red and green by a value, which could be your strength. Don't adjust the blue, and then add it all back together. So I could do a control here, normal strength, make it 1 by default, multiply that by green channel, by red channel, then append many, rebuild the color of everything. So this is a red, this is the red, green, blue, and that becomes our new normal map. And now, if we go back to our material here, we have a normal strength, and I can control the strength of that normal map. So there we go. It's very easy. So you can start to build things up, maybe make this look more interesting. Give it like a dark blue center, maybe like a cyan kind of color, and then lighter white. There we go. It starts to look a little bit like ice or something. Change the roughness just a little bit. fairly sharp, but not too sharp, maybe 0.1. And then normal strength. Maybe that doesn't look good for ice. Maybe we choose a different normal map. Something like this. Or maybe something more smooth, so it feels a little bit more glossy and not as crazy. This works pretty good. I'll do 1 strength on the normal map. That looks a bit more interesting. So we can start to build this stuff to make better materials, but you can already see, like, a little bit of work, you start to get some pretty useful materials that you can start to produce. Now, all this is a mess, and as you add more controls, it'll become more of a mess. So you want to start grouping things as well. So it's important when building these types of materials that are bigger, that have more controls. Things like all my normal map controls. I have normal map strength. I have my normal map texture. I have whether to use the parallax, occlusion, offset UVs for the normal map. I should group this all in a normal map kind of section in my instance material. And you can do that because when you click on these, anything that's a parameter, you'll see this group here. It's set to none. I could just type in a name like normals. And now if I go to other nodes, I can click on the drop down for that group and choose normals. And now it's going to group it under a section called normals. So if I save this, I go back to my instance material now, we have a section called normals with all my normal controls. Makes it much easier to collapse and expand menus when they're labeled correctly and kind of grouped. So you probably want to do that for a lot of your controls, and that'll take a little bit of time. So you can start to kind of go through this, start to make more interesting materials, and create something like this as a starting point, and then from there, see what you need, and then add more and add more. And it's really just about adding breakup controls, contrast controls, strength controls. You don't really need to do much more than what we have here, aside from just adding a little bit more control for contrast for these different textures, for strength, for coloring, and maybe a roughness breakup could use something a little bit more, like multiply it by a texture and a color or something, or actually not color for roughness, just a grayscale value. But for if you're using versions of Unreal without Substrate, you can also have controls to make the object more metallic or non-metallic. Mostly rocks and gems aren't going to be metallic, but having that control sometimes in these cases can help. You can use weird values like 0.3 metallic, which don't make much sense in real life, or wouldn't make much sense in the PBR workflow, but they might help you get a crystal or a gem that looks more like what you want. So it might be okay to cheat in those situations. And if you're using something like Substrate, then you're just going to have your facing angle and your grazing angle. Facing angle, we could go in here and add a control to tint that surface, to give it a color, reflection, or maybe just to give it an adjustment on how bright it reflects at the facing angle. So if I created like a constant 3 vector, by default, it should just be at about 5% or 0.05 for the value, 0.04. That's kind of the default of the facing angle reflection for most materials. Plastics and most things are going to be 4 to 7% reflective at the facing angle. But that will give us a control. So if we want to override that and want to adjust its look, we can. So if I were to go back here and make that as a parameter and call that F0 reflection, then I can go back here, save it. And if we look at our ice here, I'll have that F0 reflection. I can make it more reflective at the facing angle or less. It feels like a metal if I crank it up like that. So you don't want to do that. But maybe that can sometimes help. Maybe giving it a little bit of a blue tint, even though you shouldn't really, because it's for reflection color. In some cases, it can just cheat and make your gems or whatever look more like what you're wanting. So can be useful, but usually you want to keep it grayscale, no color, and then in the range of 4 to 7% reflective, or 0.04 to 0.07. So you want to add all these controls, and then you'll be able to create much more complex kind of gems and surfaces like we looked at the beginning of this video. Now, if we look at this jade material here, it has this really glossy layer that we see, and Substrate can be useful to add that. It's not required, but like now, since we do have Substrate in Unreal, you can also add a clear coat layer on top very easily. That's super adjustable and give you a lot of nice additional kind of highlights and depth. So that's something that you can do as well. But just a peek at a kind of like a fully featured material that's made all these that I showed at the beginning of the video is kind of similar to what we did. I'm just going to open it up here and you'll notice organization. I'm keeping things nicely grouped and nicely organized. So when I view it, this looks fairly organized. Maybe I could use some more reroutes and stuff to make those lines a little bit cleaner. But for the most part, I look at it, okay, things are grouped nicely. And one thing that's also very important, and I'm going to mention this because you're going to probably run into issues if you add too many texture slots, is you want to keep an eye on this texture samplers down here. Right now I see 6 out of 16 in here, and Unreal kind of limits you, or kind of there's like a little bit of a limitation of how many texture samplers you can have. If you reach the maximum, it'll just stop compiling. The shader will give you an error. The material will give you an error. This full material here is 6 out of 16. And if we go back to our little sampler that we made in the last few minutes, and you drag this onto the screen so the text resizes, it's 7 out of 16. Why is it more than that other more complex material that I have? Well, it's a little bit important, or something that you may want to just do. It's really easy to do. Whenever you create texture samplers, just click on them, set their sampler source to wrapped or shared wrap. And that way, if multiple things are using that sampler, it kind of reduces your texture sampler count here. So by just setting that to wrapped, it goes to 7 out of 16. Set this to wrapped, 6 out of 16. Set this one I can't set. That's okay, because that's not parallax occlusion mapping, but it reduces it. So you can set them to wrapped if you have an issue, or just in general, why not? I don't think it really has any visual effect, or none that I can really see. So it's totally fine to do that. Now going back to that featured material I have here, that one that's kind of fully used to do all those cool, interesting materials, I keep things grouped. I keep them organized. UV tiling. You can see how I organize this. Make this a little bit bigger. There we go. UV tiling and non-offset UV control. I have all this nicely grouped, nicely named, so I know what's kind of exposed as a parameter. I give these little names as well. So it just makes it a lot easier to look at. Now, if you want to see all these nodes in detail, the Patreon PDF for this video will have that in detail, so you can take a look at that and see exactly what I'm doing in all these little groups here. But you pretty much have all the knowledge you need to create these gemstone materials now. It's really easy. It's just a matter of playing around with it, using some parallax occlusion mapping, and adding a little bit of control based on masks and normal maps that are preferably tileable that you could use. But that's really it. So that pretty much wraps this video, and you can use that same setup to create all kinds of different materials. I've used it to create this kind of interesting glowing crystal material, the jade that we kind of already looked at, the ice kind of material, this lava, this pink crystal, and even this kind of greenish, kind of really kind of broken up crystal. You can also create a lot of other effects. You can see kind of the different looks that you can get. And it's just playing around with those same kind of patterns, just different colors, different settings dialed in. You can create a lot of different effects. So if you found this video useful, if you learned something new, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, press the bell notification button to be notified of future videos. And if you are part of the Patreon, you will get access to the PDF that will go over all this stuff in a little bit more detail. And you'll also, at the very end of that PDF, have kind of that final material that I created. And there are still things that you can add to it, but it'll show kind of that final material and each section of it in detail with a little map here, so you can see what section it is that's shown close up. So you can kind of rebuild that yourself and add on to it or adjust it to your liking, but it'll give you a more detailed base of building up that fully featured gem material. So if you're part of the Patreon, you can download that and check it out. and I'll see everybody in the next video. And don't forget to comment below on what future videos you'd like to see, and you can also join the Discord and suggest topics as well for future videos, so check that out if you haven't.